So a very, very warm welcome to this Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre talk. I'm really delighted to welcome you all today. My name is Bethany Gaunt and I am Associate Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. The centre, as many of you will know, was established 6 years ago in memory of the celebrated British historian Sir Martin Gilbert. Sir Martin published an astounding 88 books over the course of his career, covering a plethora of 20th century topics. His work as Winston Churchill's official biographer remains a go-to read for any Churchill enthusiast, of which I am sure there are many of you here today. Part of our work at the centre is to bring history alive for wide audiences, so it is really rewarding to see so many of you joining us from around the world. Our aim is to continue to bring these high-quality talks to everyone, free at the point of access, which, in a cost of living crisis, has never been more important. But having said that, we are a charity and we are also facing the same unprecedented challenges. So if you are able to support us, please do consider making a donation. I'll include a link in the chat. And on the donate page, this is new, you will find a link to a currency converter, since many of you requested that. That's just below the donate boxes, so just scroll down on that page if you'd like to use that. We're really grateful for your donations, which will enable us to continue to host these talks and engage with schools. Now, I'm really delighted to welcome today's speaker, Mr. Lee Pollock. Lee is one of our most generous supporters, and for many of you, he will be a familiar figure as a stalwart of the International Churchill Society. For those of you who have not yet had the pleasure, Lee Pollock is a historian, writer, and public speaker on the life and times of Winston Churchill. He has written for a number of acclaimed publications and appeared on high-profile media outlets in the US and Britain. He counts among his previous audiences the US House of Representatives, the Pentagon, and the US Supreme Court. Lee is a director, advisor to the board, and member of the operating committee of the International Churchill Society, and previously served as the Society's executive director. He is, in other words, a real expert on Sir Winston Churchill. Lee will speak tonight on a topic that many of you have requested, Winston Churchill's art. And after Lee's presentation, there will be time for your questions. If you could please message those to me in the chat, I will get through as many as possible. But without further ado, Lee, it's really great to have you back here today. Thank you for joining us once again, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Bethany, and welcome everyone from hopefully all around the world. I think this is the 5th talk I've done for the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center, and I'm delighted that we're keeping this streak going, and long may it flourish. I can only add in support of Bethany's comments that the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center is a wonderful tribute to someone who was both a great historian and a wonderful human being, Sir Martin Gilbert. I sometimes say if Martin had never written a single word about Winston Churchill instead of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions that he did, he still would be regarded as one of the preeminent historians of our time for all the other interesting things he wrote about. I support the Martin Gilbert Learning Center, and I encourage all of you to do so. And apparently it now takes donations in any currency you want. So there's no excuse for not supporting this wonderful organization. It's really a great tribute to Martin. The last several talks that we did were focused on more public aspects of Churchill's life. Today, we're going to turn to something that was a little more private, his passion for painting, which he pursued with Churchillian determination for some 5 decades. I hope you'll agree that it's yet another window into one of the most fascinating figures in modern history. So let's begin this exploration of the art of Winston Churchill, not in his own time, but more recently, 2 years ago, when Christie's auction house in London offered this picture for sale. It's entitled The Tower of Kutubiyya Mosque. Now, sometimes when I do this presentation, I ask people to guess who painted it, but I think you won't be surprised that it was by Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. As I'll explain in more detail in a few minutes, Churchill took up painting in 1915, just a few months after his 40th birthday. This picture was created 28 years later in 1943, when Britain was in the 5th year of the Second World War. When the war broke out in September 1939, Churchill laid down the paints and brushes which had occupied a good part of his leisure time for more than 2 decades. Simply put, leading Britain when its very existence was at stake did not leave time for a lot of entertainment. In January 1943, Churchill had traveled to Casablanca, Morocco for a 10-day meeting with President Franklin Roosevelt in what was one of the most critical gatherings of the Second World War. At the conclusion of the conference, when Roosevelt was preparing to fly back to Washington, Churchill turned to him and said, "You cannot come all this way to North Africa without seeing Marrakesh. I must be with you when you see the sunset on the Atlas Mountains." The next afternoon, these two men and their entourage set out on a procession of jeeps on what was undoubtedly a bumpy 150-mile drive to Marrakesh. They stayed at a beautiful villa, which had been occupied by the American Consul General, with a 60-foot tower, and at dusk, Churchill climbed the narrow stairs to see the view of the Atlas Mountains that he had promised the president. The problem, of course, was that Franklin Roosevelt could not climb stairs, so he was hand-carried up by 2 American officers. Churchill and Roosevelt spent an hour together in this stunning setting. It was what I call a buddy bonding moment, as this photo shows. Roosevelt left early the next morning, and as soon as he was gone, Churchill turned to his longtime valet and said, "Sawyers, get me my paint box." He quickly produced the beautiful picture I just showed you, which he sent to Franklin Roosevelt as a gift for the president's 62nd birthday, which was only a few days later. Interestingly, even though Churchill had not painted for 4 years, his art supplies apparently still traveled everywhere he went. Roosevelt hung the picture in his home in Hyde Park, New York, where it was a fitting, tangible representation of what Winston Churchill devotedly championed as the Anglo-American special relationship. In 1952, 7 years after the president's death, his family sold the painting, and it then went largely unseen for almost 50 years. When Christie's offered the picture, the estimate range was between $2 million and $3.5 million. By the way, the identity of the seller, which we can talk about during our question period, is in itself an interesting story. Bidding for this painting, which remained the only one that Churchill completed during the war, was spirited. When the auction hammer finally came down, the total purchase price was an astonishing $11.5 million, several times more than any previous Churchill painting, and I think perhaps the highest price ever paid by a work by a so-called non-professional artist. To me, this was a remarkable statement about the price of art and the value of paint. So when and how did Winston Churchill, much better known as a politician, writer, statesman, and war leader, take up painting? And what role did art play in his long and immensely productive life? And what can we learn about him from that? The answer to this begins in Churchill's middle years, at the start of 1915. He had just turned 40 and was at the apex of his meteoric political career, serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the world's greatest navy. The First World War had begun in August 1914 and soon turned into a bloody stalemate. Futile charges across no man's land were met with withering fire, and on both sides, casualties were enormous. In Churchill's memorable phrase, the troops were, quote, chewing on barbed wire. Churchill was convinced that this stalemate had to be broken, so to strike a blow against Germany's ally, the Ottoman Empire, an ambitious campaign was conceived in which the British and French navies would force the straits leading to Constantinople and bombard it into submission. Of course, as most of you know, this all went horribly wrong. The naval campaign foundered, and a subsequent army landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula was equally unsuccessful. The Allies suffered some 300,000 casualties before finally abandoning the plan altogether 9 months later. Now, Winston Churchill was not the only godfather of this effort, but he became its principal scapegoat. In May, a new government came to power in London, combining the Liberals and the Conservatives. One price the Tories extracted was that Churchill, their former member who had defected to the Liberals years before, had to go. He was donated to a meaningless sinecure position, and within a few months was out of government altogether. It seemed that his political career had come to a premature end. The psychological blow was immense. His devoted wife, Clementine, later said of that time, quote, "I thought he would die of grief." This portrait of Churchill, made by Sir William Orpen not too long after, is telling. Churchill said of this image, quote, "It is not the picture of a man, it is the picture of a man's soul." Churchill subsequently described his feelings about what had happened to him at this point, saying in his colorful way, quote, "Like a sea beast fished up from the depths, or a diver too suddenly hoisted, my veins threatened to burst. I had great anxiety and no means of relieving it." And he added, "I had long hours of utterly unwanted leisure." But then he added, quote, "And then it was that the muse of painting came to my rescue and said, 'Are these toys any good for you? They amuse some people.'" That summer, the wounded Churchill family retreated to a rented country home, Hoe Far in Surrey, near his brother Jack and Jack's wife, Gwendolyn, whose nickname was Goonie. Goonie, it turned out, was a devoted amateur artist, and one day Churchill came upon her painting in the garden. When he expressed mild curiosity, she handed him a small paint box that had belonged to one of her children, and after taking a hesitant stab, Winston Churchill was immediately, and it seems almost miraculously, hooked. Ironically, Churchill had shown little interest in any kind of art until that time. As Clementine later explained, quote, "When Winston took up painting in 1915, he had never been, up to that moment, in a picture gallery. He went with me to the National Gallery, and pausing before the first picture, a very ordinary one, he appeared absorbed in it." Clementine continued, quote, "For half an hour, he studied its technique minutely." She then explained, quote, "Next day, he again visited the gallery, but I took him this time by the left entrance instead of the right, so that I might at least be sure that he would not return to the same picture." Churchill's initial efforts at painting were tentative, as these examples show: the garden at Hoe Farm, and a portrait that Churchill made of the artist John Lavery in Lavery's studio. But Churchill progressed rapidly. After he returned to London that summer, he flung himself into his new pastime. In addition to visiting galleries to see and sometimes copy the work of masters such as Cézanne and other Impressionists, Churchill began to learn from established artists. Lavery, one of the most prominent painters of his time, and Lavery's wife Hazel, herself an artist, were an early and important influence. Hazel encouraged him to paint with more intensity and vigor. Churchill got the message, and a few years later he could say about their encounter, quote, "The spell was broken. I seized the largest brush and fell upon my victim with berserk fury." And Churchill added, "I have never felt any awe of a canvas since." That is certainly the determined Winston Churchill that we all know from history. And then he summarized his approach to painting by saying, quote, "Audacity is the only ticket." By the way, Sir John Lavery was so impressed with Churchill's painting that he would later say, quote, "Had Churchill chosen painting instead of statesmanship, I believe he would have been a great master with the brush." High compliment indeed. Later that same year, surprisingly, Winston Churchill rejoined the army in which he had served in the 1890s and spent 4 months at the front, frequently within range of German artillery fire and within yards of no man's land. Colonel Churchill earned the respect of his men, but also took the time to paint. Here is one image, very different from the bucolic landscapes which characterize much of his other work. Barely 10 miles across those trenches, a German army corporal worked at his own sketch pad. Unlike Churchill, this man had dreamed of becoming a professional artist, a dream which had ended in failure. His name was Adolf Hitler. As it turned out, Winston Churchill's political obituary was premature. A man of his intelligence and energy would not be out of government for long, and in July 1917, he returned to the cabinet in positions of increasing importance. He painted regularly, sometimes finishing a canvas in as little as 2 or 3 days, and at other times beginning outdoors en plein air, and then completing the work at Chartwell, his home in Kent. Later, during the 1930s, he built a full-fledged art studio there, and today that is home to several hundred of his pictures. In early 1921, Winston and Clementine were on holiday in Paris when they visited a place called the Galerie Drouet. This was an important venue of the time, which showed the best work of the post-impressionists and other artists. The reason they stopped at the gallery was to see an exhibit of 6 paintings by an otherwise unidentified artist named Charles Morin. We don't know the exact subject of these pictures, but they were apparently well received, as all 6 were sold, albeit we assume at modest prices. Then and subsequently, Churchill was disinclined to sell his own work, saying of his pictures, quote, "They are too bad to sell and too dear to give." Later, although he did donate many to relatives, friends, and associates. But in this case, he had apparently relented, and these were indeed 6 authentic Winston Churchills. Those pictures would have great value today, but this story, alas, has an unhappy ending. No records were kept of the sale, and today, the whereabouts of those pictures, assuming they haven't been lost, or I shudder to think, even destroyed, remains unknown. We don't know why Churchill or the gallery chose that pseudonym, but he never used it again. Nonetheless, if you happen to have a picture above your fireplace named Charles Morin, do come and see me. In March 1921, Churchill was colonial secretary and traveled to Cairo for a conference in which he and his advisors redrew the map of the Middle East after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Those advisors, of course, included notables such as Colonel T.E. Lawrence, you know him better as Lawrence of Arabia, and the legendary Gertrude Bell. This is my favorite photo of them on camelback in front of the Sphinx. And of course, being in Egypt, Churchill painted several pictures of the pyramids, including this beautiful one. After Cairo, he continued on to a week's visit in the new British-administered Mandate of Palestine and created this beautiful view of Jerusalem, the Golden City. This picture remained in the Churchill family until 2 years ago, when it was sold for an undisclosed price, surely in the millions, by Christie's in London. If I had a Churchill painting collection, this is one I would want to have in it. By late 1921, 6 years after he had first taken up a brush, Winston Churchill was increasingly secure in his artistic ability and opinions. A popular publication of the day, the Strand magazine, offered him the considerable sum of £1,000 to write about his pastime, and the result was 2 articles published in their December 1921 and January 1922 issues. The articles were highly popular, and they were republished in a larger collection of Churchill essays in the 1930s, and then in 1948 in a small standalone book entitled Painting as a Pastime. That book is so much enjoyed that it remains in print today. This little volume is a delightful account of how Churchill began to paint and the importance to him, and he thought for other people, of having at least one hobby. He explained of his, quote, "Just to paint is great fun. The colors are lovely to look at and delicious to squeeze out. Try it if you have not done so before you die." And of his own preferences, he added, quote, "I must say I like the bright colors. I cannot pretend to feel impartial about them. I rejoice with the brilliant ones and feel genuinely sorry for the poor browns." If you want to read only one thing about Churchill's art, painting as a pastime is what it should be. In 1924, Churchill finally returned to the Conservative Party and was rewarded with the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second highest in the land. As Britain struggled economically during the 1920s, Churchill's new position burdened him with responsibility, but he still found time to travel to the continent to paint, as he did back in England, and more importantly, to continue to learn. In 1927, Clementine introduced him to another prominent artist, Walter Sickert, and he and Churchill hit it off immediately. For the next 2 years, Sickert provided Churchill with valuable advice. He wrote him 2 long, in Sickert's words, teaching letters with detailed instructions about the important technicalities of painting. Sickert also taught Churchill how to use photographs, either as a preliminary source for a painting or to aid in completing one. Sickert himself, and also Edgar Degas, did the same. Another technique Churchill learned from Sickert was to apply a rectilinear grid to a canvas before beginning to paint. This particular Churchill work shows, I think I'm missing something here. Oh, excuse me. This is a image of that Churchill created of him and Walter Sickert together. And here's another important work from that time using a monochrome technique called Camus. And this was also painted from a photograph that you can see on the left. It shows Churchill, the Sickerts, and other family and friends in the dining room at Chartwell, which looks almost exactly the same today. At this time, Churchill also purchased a device known as a magic lantern. This was a kind of simple projector which could cast a photo image on a canvas from which Churchill began to paint. Having only started his artistic life at the age of 40, Churchill found it hard to master the skills of draftsmanship and felt that this kind of mechanical aid would free him to develop his sense of light, shape, and color to best effect. Walter Sickert himself did a portrait of Churchill that year, but it did not find favor with its subject. Churchill complained that it made me look like a bookie, and he gave it away soon after Sickert presented to him. While Churchill and Sickert's relationship diminished after a few years, his influence was significant. Winston wrote to Clementine at the time saying, quote, "I am really thrilled by the field he is opening to me. I see my way to paint far better pictures than I have ever thought possible before." And then Churchill added about Sickert, "He is really giving me a new lease on life as a painter." The Conservatives were defeated, in the general election in May 1929. And while Winston Churchill remained a member of the House of Commons, he was to be out of government for the next decade. These were his so-called wilderness years, during which he became the leading voice warning the Western democracies of the danger of Adolf Hitler and the rising Nazi dictatorship in Germany. For the rest of the decade, Churchill had time to travel, including visits to North America in 1929 and 1931, where he painted several pictures and also had time to work on a massive 4-volume biography of his great ancestor, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. And while the 1930s were a challenging time for Churchill's public life, they became a golden age for his life as a painter. He continued to enjoy the company of artists, one being an Anglo-French painter, Paul Maz. Churchill valued Maz's advice on painting, and he in turn recognized the importance that Winston Churchill had for the future of Britain. In 1936, after Hitler occupied the Rhineland, Maz wrote to Churchill saying, quote, "England needs you now more than ever, and I only hope that the government will have the sense of putting you at the helm of defense." Another close artistic friend of this time was William Nicholson, a respected practitioner who was particularly in demand as a portrait painter. Nicholson visited Chartwell for the first time in 1934 and soon became a favorite of the Churchill family. Years later, Churchill would write of him saying, quote, "I think the person who may have taught me the most about painting was William Nicholson." Nicholson returned the compliment, calling Churchill, quote, his most ardent pupil, and he did this charming study of Winston and Clementine together in the dining room of Chartwell. Nicholson and Churchill painted together in the early 1930s, when Nicholson gave Churchill lessons at Chartwell, and one day they both created the same still life. I'll leave it to you to guess which artist is which and which one you prefer. And now looking at this picture, I'm not sure I even remember. We'll talk about that later. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill in the 1920s had begun a love affair with the French Riviera when he and Clementine rented a villa in Cannes for 6 winter months. Now in the 1930s, this affection deepened. The light color and warmth of the south of France, especially compared to gray and cold English winters, was magic to Winston Churchill. He became a frequent, and in some cases, extended guest at a variety of homes. One in Aix-sur-Mer was owned by the former Consuelo Vanderbilt and her French husband, Jacques Balsan. Consuelo, an American heiress, had famously married Churchill's cousin, the Duke of Marlborough, in 1895, in the most notable union of American money and British aristocracy. The marriage was quickly a disaster, but it did produce not only an heir, but this famous John Singer Sargent portrait of the family. Another destination very popular with Churchill in the 1930s was the Château de l'Horizon near Cannes, owned by a wealthy American actress and socialite, Maxine Elliott. Clementine thought Maxine vulgar and snobby, but Winston visited her 6 times between 1933 and 1939, paints, brushes, and easels always in hand. But in addition to painting, there was also time for fun. Here's Winston enjoying the water slide at the chateau. If you go on a Google search, you can actually find a short film clip of the same water slide with Churchill on it. It's quite entertaining to watch. Other favorite Churchill spots on the Riviera were Les Zoraïdes at Cap Martin, which was owned by a Franco-American socialite and heiress named Daisy Fellows, and another home, La Dragonnière at Cap Martin, which belonged to the English press magnate, Lord Rothermere. As time went on, the lifestyle of Riviera society appealed to Clementine less and less. As she explained later in a letter to her daughter, Sarah, quote, "God, the Riviera is a ghastly place, but I expect it's all right if you keep a flower shop or if you're a waiter." It's quite a put down. Some of Churchill's French hosts were anathema to her, and she liked even less the fact that Winston enjoyed visiting the casinos, where he sometimes, in fact often, lost more than he could afford, and even worse, more than he would admit to her. But Churchill was always an honored guest who could make his own schedule and, frankly, do exactly as he pleased without much thought or much consideration. In the troubled times of the 1930s, the light color and sunshine of Riviera and the opportunity to paint at leisure were a tonic for Churchill's soul and a foil to the melancholy that might otherwise have plagued him. Here are just a few of the some 250 pictures that Churchill painted in the south of France during those years. St. Paul de Vence, the fountain, a lovely study of boats in Cannes Harbor, and this beautiful view of Monte Carlo. And then in the 1930s, Churchill added another very important painterly destination, Marrakesh, which he first visited in 1935. His hotel there had a large balcony, and he told Clementine that it offered, quote, "a truly remarkable panorama over the tops of orange trees and olives and the houses and ramparts of Marrakesh, all the way to the snow-clad range of the Atlas Mountains." Churchill continued, quote, "the light at dawn and the sunset upon the snows is as good as any I have ever seen." Here are a couple of pictures from that time, a street scene from 1936, and the Valley of the Eureka in the same year. Churchill kept on painting through the 1930s, right up to the British declaration of war against Germany on September 3rd, 1939. In addition to these destinations on the continent, he indulged his passion when visiting country homes, including Trent Park, home of his friend Philip Sassoon, and Knebworth House, where he stayed with Lady Pamela Lytton. She had been his first love in India decades before and remained a dear friend. By the way, this picture of Knebworth, which was sold by Christie's a couple of years ago, might not actually be that place. One of our members, who's a Churchill collector, thinks it's actually in the south of France, and that's something that we shall investigate further. Painting in plein air was always Churchill's favorite activity, but sometimes the weather, especially in England, didn't cooperate, and Churchill developed a taste for still lifes and interior scenes. Here are two examples: a still life of Silver at Chartwell from the 1930s, and one of my favorite pictures, the Tapestry Room at Blenheim Palace. In August 1939, Churchill again visited with Paul Maz, this time at another home owned by Consuelo and Jacques Balsan, the Chateau de Saint-Georges Motel, 50 miles outside of Paris. Anticipating what was soon to come, Churchill turned to Maz and said, "This is the last picture we shall paint in peace for a very long time." And then Churchill added, "Before the harvest is gathered, we shall be at war." And so it was. When the war did begin, Churchill returned to government as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he had held 25 years earlier, and 8 months later became Prime Minister as Britain faced the greatest threat in its history. Churchill was up to the challenge, famously saying later, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. I was sure I would not fail." But now there would be no time or thought for painting. The main house at Chartwell was closed up, and the Churchills spent the next 5 years at number 10 Downing Street in London and at the Prime Minister's official country residence, Chequers. 6 years later, the Second World War in Europe ended at long last on May 8, 1945. On that VE Day, Churchill addressed a jubilant crowd from the balcony of the Ministry of Health building saying, quote, "My dear friends, this is your hour. This is not the victory of a party or of any class. It's a victory of the great British nation as a whole." Since May 1940, Britain had been governed by a coalition of Churchill's conservatives, allied with the principal opposition party, Labour, led by Clement Attlee. Attlee and his colleagues served loyally and effectively with Churchill, and Winston had hoped to continue the coalition until the defeat of Japan. But Labour withdrew, and a new election, the first since 1935, was scheduled for July. Winston Churchill individually was enormously popular, but the Tory party itself, as it turned out, was another matter. To many Britons, it represented what had been wrong with our government and society in the 1920s and 30s. It was Labour that would deliver the brave new world and the welfare state that millions had fought for. Churchill traveled to Potsdam, just outside Berlin, in mid-July for the first post-war meeting with Stalin and the new American president, Harry Truman. He returned to London to await the announcement of the election result on July 26th, confident that he would remain in power. The outcome, of course, was shocking. Labour swept in with a thumping majority, and the Churchill era, at least for now, was over. Clementine had hoped that Winston would retire with honor at the end of the war, and attempted to console him, saying, quote, "The defeat was a blessing in disguise." He responded, quote, "My dear, at the moment, it seems quite effectively disguised." But what now was a blessing was that for the first time since the 1930s, Winston Churchill had time for something other than politics, and painting would, of course, be foremost among his leisure activities. The first opportunity came when Churchill was offered the use of a villa on the shores of Lake Como in northern Italy. He arrived on September 2nd, and the next day, his mood apparently lifting, wrote to Clementine, quote, "This is really one of the most pleasant and delectable places I have ever visited. The weather is delightful, bright and warm with cool breezes." And he added, quote, "Yesterday, I found a good subject for a picture. I made a good beginning and hope to be back there tomorrow." And in another letter home from this extended vacation, Churchill reported, quote, "I am confident that with a few more months of regular practice, I shall be able to paint far better than I ever have before." He added, "This new interest is very necessary in my life." This is one of the 15 pictures from what turned out to be a 25-day holiday. Churchill's spirits had been revived, and painting had clearly played an important part. Winston Churchill's youngest daughter, Mary, summarized this best, saying, quote, "Those weeks of beautiful and changing scenes, of balmy air and good companionship, had restored him in body, mind, and spirit. They had distanced the humiliation he had suffered and put it in proportion." But then she added also, "But above all, he had reestablished his brush skill and discovered again his passion for painting." And while Winston Churchill's spirits had been buoyed, the strain of war had nonetheless weakened him. As 1945 drew to a close, his doctor, Lord Moran, advised him to get away from what would be yet another cold, damp English winter. The result was a near 3-month trip to the US that began in January 1946. Churchill's acceptance of Lord Moran's advice was made easier when he received an invitation to speak at a small, little-known college in Fulton, Missouri. He would ordinarily have turned down the request, but scribbled at the bottom was a handwritten note that read, quote, "This is a fine school in my home state. Hope you can do it. I'll introduce you." The note was from President Harry Truman, and Churchill immediately recognized that sharing a podium with the leader of the world's only nuclear superpower would be an important opportunity for a major statement that would be heard in America and in Britain, and in Moscow too. The result, of course, was the iconic Iron Curtain speech, delivered on March 5th, 1946, in which Churchill warned of the danger of Soviet expansion and called on the US and Britain to solidify their, quote, special relationship to preserve world peace. When Churchill had arrived in America in January, he was to spend 6 weeks first vacationing in South Florida. We, of course, painted several pictures, including this Miami scene of the Venetian Causeway. He again visited Consuelo and Jacques, this time at the sumptuous home they had built near Palm Beach, called Casa Alva, which was named after Consuelo's Cuban-born mother. Churchill painted this picture of the garden at Casa Alva, and here is a delightful photograph with Clementine watching of him doing just that. Politics, of course, continued at home, and finally in the general election of October 1951, the Tories eked out a small majority in the House of Commons. The country, it seemed, had grown tired of socialism, and Winston and Clementine were back at number 10 Downing Street. Churchill continued painting in the late 1940s, and to a lesser extent when he returned as prime minister. He still preferred landscapes, still lifes, and some interior scenes, but occasionally the opportunity to create a compelling portrait could not be resisted. One of his favorite photographs of Clementine was taken at the launching of a battleship in March 1940. 14 years later, Churchill painted a portrait based on that, which became a favorite of the entire Churchill family. Another highlight of Churchill's painting life occurred in 1948, when he was persuaded to submit 3 of his pictures under the pseudonym Mr. David Winter to be considered for the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts. Since its founding in 1768, the RA, of course, has been the preeminent association of artists in Britain, and its summer exhibition is still growing strong 2.5 centuries later. I was very much pleased to be able to see it in July this summer in London. The selection committee for the exhibition accepted all 3 of Mr. Winter's works, and Churchill, modest as he always was about his art, was surely pleased. Even greater recognition came when the RA elected him as, quote, an honorary academician extraordinary, the only one in his history. He continued to submit several pictures each summer, but now under his own name. They were, of course, more or less automatically accepted. As Winston Churchill approached his 80th birthday, he became burdened with ill health, including a near-fatal stroke in 1953. He finally retired in April 1955, having just entered his 90th decade of life. The night before, a celebratory dinner was held at number 10 Downing Street. In a break with precedent, the Queen herself attended, paying tribute to the first of her many prime ministers. Churchill, ever the monarchist, bowed deeply as the Queen entered. 5 years later, Churchill selected one of his own paintings, the Palladian Bridge at Wilton, to give to the Queen. It remained one of her prized possessions, and over 60 years later is still on display at Windsor Castle. Painting remained an activity of Churchill, although practiced with decreasing energy and vigor. Opportunities came on Churchill's extended winter visits to his favorite sunny places, including Marrakesh once again, and the south of France. In Morocco, he favored the classic La Mamounia Hotel, which to this day has a splendid Churchill suite. I sadly have never stayed there, but you can, and it's only $4,000 a night. On the Riviera, when visiting France, he was the treasured guest of old friends such as Lord Beaverbrook, who had a magnificent villa named La Compancina. Churchill first visited there in 1948, and then twice during his second term as prime minister. Here he is in the garden there, enjoying, of course, his favorite beverage, champagne. More trips to Beaverbrook's home ensued, and the Churchills happily celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary there in 1958. Another new spot that quickly became a Churchill favorite was La Pausa, which was the former home of Coco Chanel. It was now owned by Churchill's literary agent, Emery Reeves, and Emery's fashion model wife, Wendy. Churchill made the first of what would be many regular visits there in January 1956. The Reeves doted on him, and Wendy redecorated the entire third floor of the house to accommodate Churchill and his entourage. Churchill nicknamed this home Pausaland, and the time he spent there was certainly made even more satisfying by the works of Renoir, Manet, Degas, Pissarro, and other greats from the Reeves art collection that hung on its walls. Churchill also took 8 cruises in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean from 1958 to 1963 on an immense private yacht, the Christina, owned by the Greek shipping tycoon Aristotle Onassis. Onassis was a self-made man and was certainly proud of his association with Churchill, and especially to be given a painting, the Moat at Breckles, which hung in the boat's stateroom. The picture was thought to have been lost, but actually had remained in the Onassis family after his death in 1975. 2 years ago, it was sold for just over $2 million. With Churchill's new global fame came more interest in his art. A major exhibit sponsored by the Hallmark Company opened in Kansas City in 1958 and traveled around the world, including to the Royal Academy. Exhibitions of various sizes have been held regularly since then, and a major retrospective is being planned by a museum in London for 2025 or 2026. Churchill's last picture was completed in 1962, a study of his beloved goldfish pond at Chartwell. He had painted it some 30 years before in a canvas that became a favorite of his daughter Mary. This last picture of the same subject was somewhat different. Most likely it reflected Churchill's declining powers, and perhaps its dark colors said something about his state of mind. Or was perhaps Winston Churchill developing a taste for abstraction? When this was put up for auction at Sotheby's in London 5 years ago, the picture was sufficiently unusual that the pre-sale estimate was a conservative 500,000 to 800,000 pounds. It sold for almost 5 times that amount. Old age fell more heavily on Winston Churchill as he approached his 90th birthday. The exercise of power had been the elixir that propelled him through his eventful life, and without that, he inevitably declined. The end drew nigh in January 1965, when just a few weeks after his 90th birthday, Churchill suffered a massive stroke. Once a prophet without honor, but now hailed as the greatest statesman of the century, Churchill lingered, largely in a coma, until he died early in the morning of January 24th, exactly 70 years to the day after his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. Churchill's granddaughter, Celia Sands, had accompanied him on many of his travels in his last years and was at his bedside. She later recounted that in one of his last gestures, his hand lifted slightly and his fingers curled as if he was grasping his paintbrush for the last time. 6 days later, a great state funeral was held at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. 25 years earlier, an iconic photo of that cathedral, rising undamaged above the smoke of German bombs, had come to symbolize the will and resilience of Winston Churchill and the British people. Churchill always had an ambivalent view of the afterlife. He alluded to the existence of a higher being, but he would be better described as an uncertain agnostic. Life after death, however, seemed to hold no terror for him. He once jested, "I am prepared to meet my maker. Whether my maker is prepared for the ordeal of meeting me is another matter altogether." He once described death as, quote, "black velvet, eternal sleep," but at other times seemed to look forward to heaven. He was particularly keen to meet great men of history, such as Julius Caesar and Napoleon, and certainly would have felt him to be their equal. More particularly, when contemplating the future, he once said, quote, "When I get to heaven, I mean to spend a considerable portion of my first 1,000,000 years in painting, and so to get to the bottom of the subject." So if there is any justice in this world or the next, Winston Churchill is now up there with the other greats. He is only 58 years into the first 1,000,000, so he must surely be looking forward to many more years of painting and learning. Those of us still here on Earth, whether we be amateur dabblers or just aficionados of art, can take comfort in Churchill's words, quote, "Happy are the painters, for they shall not be lonely. Light and color, peace and hope will keep them company to the end of the day." Churchill himself revealingly admitted, quote, "If it weren't for painting, I couldn't live. I couldn't bear the strain of things." So let me leave you with one final thought, paraphrasing the words of my friend, the historian Sir David Cannadine. Sir David writes, quote, "Winston Churchill always denied that he was a great painter and was modest about what he called his little daubs. Each of us, amateur or professional, can have our own opinion of his art." But Sir David continues, "But Churchill was a great man at a time when the world desperately needed one, when freedom turned on the hinge of fate. Unquestionably, painting helped to make him great, and for that, we can be truly thankful." Well-spoken words, I think, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Lee. As always, you've weaved together so much fascinating information there, and it's amazing to see actually the versatility of Churchill's artistic output. I mean, those paintings are very different from one another, and a wonderful photo. So thank you so much for pulling that together and sharing it with us. We've had so much interest in the chat, so I will try and get through as many questions as I can without putting too much of a strain on Lee, who so generously gives up his time for us. So to start, I'll take the first question that we had in the chat, which you tantalized us right at the beginning with that. The question of the ownership of the painting that Churchill gave to Franklin Roosevelt. Could you talk to us a bit more about that?
Sure.
Who bought and who sold?
It's a good detective story.
Yeah.
After the Roosevelt family sold it in the 50s, it was owned by a businessman named Norman Hickman, and then it seemed to have sort of disappeared. I'm quite friendly with a man in New Orleans named Bill Rao, whose gallery, Rao Antiques, is, I think, the largest art and antique gallery in the United States now. And Bill is an active dealer in Churchill paintings, probably more than almost anyone else. He called me up about 10 years ago excitedly saying, "Lee, guess what I have?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "I have the Franklin Roosevelt painting." So I actually went down to New Orleans and I was photographed. I have a hammy picture of me next to this famous painting doing a V for Victory. Bill put it on the market at the time for $2.9 million. This is in 2011, and sold it in a few weeks. So being in the Churchill business as I am, I wanted to know who bought it, because I thought whoever could pay that for a Churchill painting might be someone who should support the Churchill Society. course, Bill, like other art dealers, doesn't want to tell anyone who his clients are. And all he would say, which he did an interview with one of the newspapers in New Orleans, it was purchased by a high-profile celebrity. Well, that doesn't help too much. And then my very insightful wife said, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie have a home in New Orleans. And then I remembered that she had over the years expressed an interest in making a film about Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. At one point, she had Anthony Hopkins to agree to play Churchill, which would have been a wonderful performance. The film was never made. And one of her many tattoos is the date, May 13th, 1940, when Churchill gave his first speech to the House of Commons after becoming prime minister. So I put 2 and 2 together, and I didn't get 4, I got 3.5, because you can't exactly go ring their doorbell and say, "Can I see your painting, please?" And then I was having lunch with David Cannadine in New York, and I mentioned this to him, and I told him I'd sort of been stumped. I couldn't get past the assistant to the assistant of Angelina Jolie. And he said, "Well, a friend of mine is Brad Pitt's military advisor for all the war films he makes, and I'll ask him." So as it turned out, they did acknowledge they owned the picture, and they would be happy to lend it to an exhibit. So it was displayed at an exhibit of Churchill's paintings at the Millennium Gate Museum in Atlanta in 2012, and I think once or twice afterwards. Fast forward, unfortunately, to recent times, they go through a protracted and apparently quite bitter divorce.
Yeah.
And she decides to sell the painting, whether it's out of spite or to settle their divorce or whatever. So that's how it ended up coming to market. The unfortunate part, once again, is we don't know who bought it, because Christie's is not going to tell us that. There's some suspicion. I think perhaps someone in the Churchill family knows, but are sworn to secrecy. So where that picture is now, once again, is lost in time. Hopefully, it'll be lent to the exhibit in London that I think will be coming out in a couple of years. So that's the detective story about that picture, and who knows when it shall emerge next and who owns it. We stay tuned, and we'll hopefully find out.
Fantastic, thank you. Maybe your next talk for us on art, we'll cover
If the
that in the
person who owns
update.
that painting is listening, please email me.
You've heard it here first. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. We had a question about Churchill and the sort of progression of art during his career, and modernism and abstract art. And you touched on this a bit with the goldfish pond at Chartwell painting. But what did Churchill think of modern and abstract art?
My sense of that is that he recognized the importance of progress in art. In the late 1930s, he gave a speech to the annual banquet of the Royal Academy, and the gist of that was that it's important for a place like the Royal Academy and its members to preserve tradition, but not to be stuck in tradition. He tried to, so in his public comments, he tried to strike a balance between tradition and progress in art. There's a amusing story. The president of the Royal Academy, I think this is the late 1950s, was Sir Alfred Munnings, a dedicated traditionalist and conservative in all respects. He was a very fine horse painter, and if you want a great painting of English horses, Munnings is the gold standard. And he also enjoyed a drink or two. So the story is that at this banquet of the Royal Academy, Munnings has had far too much to drink, gets up and makes a speech, and Churchill's there, and he starts talking about Picasso. And the gist of the story is Munnings says, I was walking down the street with Mr. Churchill, and I said to him, "Mr. Churchill, if Pablo Picasso walked by, would you," and this is more or less a quote, "would you join me in kicking him in the arse?" And suggested that Churchill had agreed. Now, Churchill was quite annoyed by this and wrote Munnings a letter saying, "I never walked down the street with you, and we never saw Picasso, and I never would have said that, so please stop doing this." And that's created a sufficient scandal that Munnings was forced out as president of the Royal Academy afterwards. I don't know that there's too much evidence of what Churchill really thought about Picasso or the other great abstract artists, or the artists of Britain in the mid 20th century. As I mentioned, Churchill was close to William Nicholson. Nicholson's son, Ben, I think, is one of the most significant British, I believe, abstract artists of the late 20th century. Perhaps Churchill would have found favor with Churchill because Nicholson Sr. was such a good friend and inspiration to him.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's awesome. I'm aware of the time, so maybe we can just do a couple more paintings? No, questions, if that's all right.
As much time as you like, and people are also invited to email me if they would like. My email's on the screen, and I'm happy to answer any more questions. And one other thing I'll mention is there are a number of articles about Churchill paintings on our website, winstonchurchill.org. And Sir David Cannadine wrote a wonderful book a few years ago called The Statesman as Artist, which includes the full text of Churchill's Painting as a Pastime book, and a wonderful essay by Sir David about the significance of painting in Churchill's life. So that's a wonderful thing to read to get started. And the last thing I'll mention is there's a recent beautiful coffee table book by a British artist and writer, Paul Rafferty, about Churchill's painting in the south of France. Paul went to as many of the locations of those paintings as he could find, took photographs of the way where they are today, and compared them to the images that Churchill painted in the 30s and 40s. The one, if you want a Churchill painting coffee table book, that's a wonderful one to have.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'll second you that the International Churchill Society website is such an amazing source of information on all things Churchill, so definitely worth checking out. We have a question from Julian, who asks, did Churchill paint Chartwell and Blenheim Palace during his lifetime?
Well, I showed one image of the tapestry room at Blenheim. He did several paintings of the interior of Blenheim, and I think there are a couple of landscapes that show Blenheim in the background. He painted outside at Chartwell. There's the view of the Weald of Kent that he painted there, and then the Goldfish Pond. So Chartwell itself figures in several of Churchill's pictures, and the studio there is a wonderful place to visit. They have 200 to 300 of his pictures, and it's really, of any visit to Chartwell, it's certainly one of the highlights.
Yes, Alan Berridge has helpfully signposted that in the chat about Chartwell. Is there anywhere else that people can go to see Churchill paintings?
There isn't any other major location. There are a couple of collectors in the US. I know one collector in the US, and they're pretty private about this, has 16 Churchill paintings, a wonderful collection. Someone else I know has 8, and they're here and there. The other person who has some, because it's been public, is a gentleman down in Dallas who's got 8 Churchill pictures, and also has a painting, believe it or not, that Dwight D. Eisenhower did of Churchill, because Ike became a painter in the 1940s and 50s, somewhat inspired by Churchill's example. I think Churchill was a better painter, but that's another story. So the whole subject of statesmen or politicians as painters is something that's interesting. But there aren't any, like, outside of Chartwell, there aren't any big public collections. Hopefully this exhibit in London will happen in 2 or 3 years from now, and then there'll be a chance for people to see a whole bunch of pictures all together.
Brilliant, thank you. And you have just touched on this, but we had a couple of questions about the link between Churchill and Eisenhower, and if Churchill encouraged Eisenhower to take up painting. So, brilliant.
I think Eisenhower took up painting, and after he left the military in after the Second World War, and I think, if I remember correctly, was encouraged or inspired by Churchill. And Ike was very modest about, as Churchill was very modest about his pictures. At one point, some reporter expressed something, made a favorable comment about Ike's paintings. And Ike replied, "You damn well know if these weren't painted by me, they wouldn't be worth your SHIT." The picture that the portrait that Eisenhower did of Churchill was a copy of a portrait by Arthur Pan, a British artist that had done a very fine portrait of Churchill in the 1940s. And when you put the two of them side by side, it's interesting to look at what the differences are. They look like the same picture when you look at the detail. For example, the hands, and Churchill had very soft, beautiful hands he was actually proud of. And you look at the original Arthur Pan original portrait, and there's a subtlety to how the hands are presented. And in Ike's copy of the Pan portrait, the hands don't have that subtleness. They're somewhat more crudely represented. So you put those pictures side by side, you can see some of the subtleties, that copying a picture is one thing, but really creating something that's artistic that a professional artist does is another matter.
Absolutely, bit trickier. We have a couple of questions about Madeira and how many paintings Churchill started and or finished when he visited Madeira in 1950. I don't know if you're able to say anything
Uh,
about that.
I don't know. I don't know the exact number. I think on our Churchill Society website, we've had an article or two. I think he stayed at the I think it's called the Reed's Palace Hotel. And Churchill could paint pretty quickly. He could do in a week's visit, he could do 3, 4, 5 pictures. But I don't know the exact number, and I can't tell you off the top of my head where they are. There's a book by David Coombs and Minnie Churchill that came out a few years ago, and I think you can still get it from secondhand bookshops, which is the definitive catalogue raisonné of Churchill's paintings. And there's a art historian at Churchill College, Cambridge, who's keeping a database of this. It would be, he painted over 500 pictures. Some of them have been lost. We know that there's a reference that he painted a picture of some place in the south of France at a certain time, but we don't know where those pictures are. And the problem today is because they are so valuable, when they come up for sale, they're typically not bought by museums, they're bought by private collectors, and then they can disappear again. So some of these paintings have become in the public record in terms of where they are, and then they disappear again. And hopefully at some point, all of the information in the catalogue raisonné that David and Minnie put together will be digitized and available online, as opposed to having a hefty book you have to page through to find things. So I don't know the exact number, but I think it was at least a couple.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think I'll pick one to finish, which is you mentioned the tapestries at Blenheim Palace, but which Churchill paintings are your favourites?
Well, some of the ones I've mentioned, I love the one of the tapestry room at Blenheim because it's such a historic place. I'm Jewish, so the one of Jerusalem, to me, touches a special chord. I'm Canadian American, so the couple he did in the United States appealed to me. I spent the winter, not too far from Miami, so that one of the Venetian Causeway is quite lovely. And there's I actually, as a final coda, I was at a party here in Palm Beach last week, and I mentioned to someone I was introduced to that I was a Churchill historian. And he said, oh, Churchill was quite friendly with my grandfather. And sometimes people say that. His grandfather was a Canadian business tycoon named Colonel Frank Clark, who owned the home that the Churchills used in 1946. And he said he gave the picture to my grandfather. We sold it 50 years ago for $25,000, and we wish we hadn't.
I bet.
Small world.
Goodness me, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Lee. It's always a pleasure to host you, and I hope you'll come back and do another talk for us before too long. And for you, everyone joining us today, if today has whet your appetite for all things Churchill, then we have got a 4-week course starting with Alan Packwood next week. So you can head to our website for more information on that, or just drop me an email and I'll be happy to share the details with you. But thanks again, Lee, and thank you all for joining us, and we'll speak soon. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.